All right, so we have this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. The idea is that when we're at our lungs, right, where we have about, PO2 is about 100, that just means that our hemoglobin is going to be about 100% saturated, right? Of all the hemoglobin that we have, saturation, we're just saying how much of it is full of oxygen. Okay, so in the lungs, where there's more oxygen, our hemoglobin is about 100% saturated. Does that make sense? So in the lungs, where we have lots of oxygen, the hemoglobin is about 100% saturated with oxygen. Are we good with that? Okay. So now as we get down to the tissues, so this is, what figure is this? 2317 for me. But as we get to the tissues, right, our oxygen is going to be leaving. It's going to be going to the tissue. So this is using an example of a cup full of water. If we were at basically 100%, right, in our tissues that are resting, so as you're sitting here, the muscles in your legs, let's say, 25% of that oxygen is going to go to your tissues. But the rest of it, the other 75%, is going to stay in your blood. But as we spend more energy, and so the reason is because the pressure of oxygen has gone down. Well, anyway, I'm not going to make it more confusing than it needs to be. So now in your tissues that are exercising, let's say I'm running a marathon like so many did last Saturday. A few didn't make it all the way through. Got to take care of those. But in that scenario, your tissues are using a lot more oxygen. They're putting off a lot more carbon dioxide. So down there, right, 75% of that oxygen goes to your tissues, and only 25 stays with the blood, the hemoglobin. So we're just saying that the higher the pressure of oxygen, right, in our surroundings, the more it's going to stay on the hemoglobin. As we get down to the tissues, there's not as much oxygen in the surroundings, so oxygen is going to leave and go to those tissues.
When you say the higher the pressure, is that when you're talking about like if it was resting or if someone was like exercising?
Either way. So if they're resting, there's going to be a higher overall concentration of oxygen in the tissues, so we're not going to dump off as much. But if they're exercising, there's not going to be as much concentration or pressure of oxygen in the tissue, so we're going to dump off more.
More to the tissues.
Right.
Okay. And this might sound silly. Is it always 25-75, or is that just the example?
That's just an example. I mean, the more oxygen that we need, the more we're going to give those tissues.
So when the blood holds on to the oxygen, it will just circle back around and still be oxygenated when it comes to the lungs? Yeah, there may be some blood coming back. There's usually going to be some oxygen still coming back. It's just most of it's gone. Fair enough.
Okay. So that's that oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Everybody, does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, it makes more sense in the book.
This can be a pretty complicated topic, so I'm trying to simplify it. But I taught this. We covered the blood in one of our classes last semester, and my group taught this, and I taught this part, and there were paramedic students that were like, "Wait, what?" So you guys are doing good.
How does the pH have to do?
That's where we're going. So we can shift this curve to the right or to the left. And really what we're saying is when we shift this curve, we're just saying that we're making it easier for oxygen to leave. We're making oxygen want to leave more. Or, so that's a right shift, oxygen is going to leave easier. If we shift it left, we're going to make the oxygen want to stay more. Okay? So in a right shift, normally if our pressure or our concentration of oxygen is at 20, normally we'd have about 30% saturation of oxygen. Okay? But if I shift this curve to the right, if I do something in the body that makes this curve shift, now at the same pressure, there's only 30% oxygen. Basically, the hemoglobin's not hanging on to oxygen as well because the oxygen wants to leave a little bit easier. Okay? Everybody good with that? So, if you get stuck at all or I say something, you're like, wait, what?
So if it shifts right, oxygen wants to leave. Okay.
Easier. It's still going to leave, right? But it's going to be easier for it to leave when there's a right shift. So what type of things cause a right shift? What type of things make oxygen want to leave easier? Okay. Anybody know?
Just pH.
Oh, like exercise. Like if you're like creating more like CO2, there's more of a need for oxygen, and so it'll need to leave.
Exactly. So one of the things that causes a right shift is an increase in carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide there is, carbon dioxide is kind of like the bully. It's what drives our respiration. I mean, oxygen is what we need, but we measure, how fast we need to breathe. That's all measured based off of pH and CO2. So, for example, high CO2 when you're exercising, your body's producing a lot of CO2. That CO2 is going to force more oxygen to leave, and that's why we're getting this right shift. Make sense? More CO2, there can only be one or the other on the hemoglobin, right? So CO2 essentially forces the oxygen off. Okay?
Would it be the same kind of thing if you're like high altitude, like how would that affect that?
So high altitude is going to affect it. For one, there's not as much oxygen in the air, period. So your initial saturation is not going to be as high. And so your tissues are not going to get as much. So your tissues are going to be starving more, essentially. And so they're going to be producing more CO2. And so it could cause this right shift just because there's going to be more CO2. There's going to be more of an oxygen demand, period.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's because there's just not as much oxygen available in the air. Okay. So if CO2 is high, what does that do to our pH?
Drops the pH, right?
Makes it low, and why is that?
Because it drops off the hydrogen. The hydrogen is going to make it lower, more acidic, so it's going to drop it. Because it reacts with water, it becomes carbonic acid, then disassociates into bicarbonate, drops the hydrogen off, lowers our pH.
You've got it.
Bam.
It was a refresher for the EMT course this chapter was. So
Oh, yeah?
it kind of clicked, yeah.